We last spoke of Darius III of Persia, the eternal rival of Alexander, who met his end at the hands of his own men following the Battle of Gorgamla. Now, the established fact is this: by the time Alexander arrived on the scene, the body of his sworn enemy was already quite cold, but the version of events promulgated by the Macedonian public relations machine, that was another story entirely. According to the official narrative, when Alexander reached the grim location, Darius III was still clinging to life. He is said to have grasped Alexander's hand, tears streaming down his face, and with a trembling voice, designated him the rightful heir to the Persian throne. He entrusted to Alexander the care of his mother, his wife, and his daughters, and of course, the far more significant matter of ruling Persia as a good and just king. Alexander's regime rendered this account with such meticulous detail, it felt unimpeachable. Should you doubt its veracity, you were invited to ask any of the soldiers present. They had all, apparently, seen it with their own eyes and heard it with their own ears. A pity no one dared to ask, and had one been so bold, it is unlikely anyone would have dared to admit to having heard nothing. And then, a truly farcical chapter began. From that day forward, every one of Alexander's military campaigns within Persian territory was reframed. He was no longer a conqueror. He was an avenger, on a sacred quest to punish the traitor Bessus and seek justice for his dear, departed brother, Darius. And let us not forget, he now had the Persian queen mother, Sisygambis, in his corner. The affection with which Alexander now called her mother was a performance of filial piety for the ages, as the old saying goes. When the tree falls, the monkeys scatter. With Darius dead, the four great capitals of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Ecbatana, Susa, and Persepolis, fell one after another. The people of Persepolis, it must be said, drew the shortest straw. Alexander permitted his soldiers to sack and slaughter their way through the city without restraint. Then, for good measure, he put the grand palace of Xerxes I to the torch, burning it to the ground. Eventually, of course, the villain of the peace, Bessus, was captured. After enduring the most brutal of tortures, his head was unceremoniously severed from his body, with Persia thoroughly conquered and the crown placed upon his own head. Alexander's habits began to change. His lifestyle grew lavish, and then more lavish still. Most conspicuously, he adopted the Persian rite of proskyneses, the ritual of obeisance. This was a complex affair, ranging from a simple kiss to the foot or hand to the ultimate gesture, full, groveling prostration upon the floor. It was a display of submission more absolute than any the Hellenic world had ever conceived. The Macedonians, indeed the Greeks in general, had never seen anything like it. They knelt, perhaps, before the statues of their gods, and even that was a simple bow of the head. When speaking to their own king, they stood. To now see Alexander, preening on his throne, accepting the abject worship of former Persian officials with their rumps in the air. It was, to say the least, unsettling. One evening, Cleitus the Black, the very man who had saved Alexander's life in his first great battle, had a bit too much to drink. He loudly berated the king, accusing him of forgetting his roots, of abandoning his purpose, of becoming corrupt and decadent. He had not counted, however, on the fact that Alexander had also had too much to drink. In a moment of wine-fueled rage, a single, uncontrolled impulse, Alexander drew his sword and killed his savior. These actions cultivated a palpable sense of crisis among the Macedonian high command. They felt fear, certainly, but also a stinging humiliation, a sense of betrayal. And so it was that a faction within the Macedonian legions began to plot his overthrow. Among them was Philotas, son of Parmenion, who was arguably the second most powerful man in the entire Macedonian enterprise. Regrettably for them, their conspiracy was amateurishly inept. Before they could even raise a banner, the plot was exposed. Not only was Philotas executed, but his father, the great general Parmenion, who had served Macedonia with such distinction, was not spared. Alexander used the son's treason as the perfect pretext to have the old man's head removed. We often speak of sons who bring ruin upon their fathers. Philotas was the archetype. He likely never suspected that Alexander had known of the plot all along, that he may have even secretly encouraged it. All to find an expedient reason to eliminate a powerful old general who had, perhaps, outlived his usefulness. There are no simple men among those whom history calls the great, and precious few who are soft of heart. Having completed this internal purge and solidified his rule over Central Asia, Alexander turned his gaze further east, toward the Indian subcontinent. We shall pass over the details of his Indian campaign. Those with a particular interest may investigate the matter for themselves. Suffice it to say, after a string of victories, Alexander and his men arrived at the banks of the river Ganges. He raised a hand and declared, "We cross the Ganges and liberate all of India." He then turned, expecting a roar of acclamation. He was met with silence. His Macedonian generals and their soldiers stood motionless, their faces impassive. In that moment of profound and awkward silence, Alexander the Great finally understood. His men were done. They were weary of war, and they were particularly weary of war in India. It was not just the suffocating heat, it was the enemy's war elephants which inspired a primal terror. Their ambition was now a simple one. They no longer wished to follow Alexander's revolution. They wished to go home to the Balkan Peninsula, to their native Macedonia. Whether or not a sweetheart waited for them was irrelevant. Anything was better than endless fighting and a pointless death in this foreign land. The will of the masses is a tide that cannot be turned, even if you are Alexander. He had no choice. He led his grand army back to Persia, returning to Babylon in the year 324 BC and declaring it the new capital of the Macedonian Empire. If we mark the beginning from that bright spring of 335 BC, when he first set out to quell rebellions in Greece, then 11 years had now passed. In that short span, this one man had forged the largest empire the world had yet seen. The first great empire to span Europe, Asia, and Africa was, to be sure, Persia. But the Persians had taken generations, centuries, to build their domain. Alexander's empire not only straddled the three continents, its territory dwarfed that of Persia. How large was it? Open a map. If you have one to hand, and steel yourself, for the recitation is extensive. Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and on and on. All or most of the territory of these modern nations once belonged to Alexander. And all of it was conquered by him and his Macedonian soldiers in a mere 11 years. At this, some might say, based on your account, he doesn't sound so remarkable. It seems he just charged the enemy commander at the start of every battle, and his opponents simply collapsed. This is a point worth elaborating upon. There is an ancient standard by which great commanders may be judged, a measure of 5 cardinal virtues: courage, wisdom, benevolence, integrity, and discipline. Let us measure Alexander against this standard. First, courage. This is beyond dispute. He never hesitated to lead the charge from the front. Second, wisdom. We have already noted how, at Gorgamla, he deliberately spread disinformation about a night attack, and how, at the Battle of Issus, he identified the enemy's weakness with a single glance. This was true strategic wisdom. Then, benevolence and integrity. These were manifest in the clear and fair system of rewards and punishments he maintained for his subordinates. Though in his later years, luxury and indulgence led him astray, it was these qualities in his early campaigns that inspired such ferocious loyalty. And finally, discipline. Every time he led his companion cavalry in a charge, the rest of the Macedonian infantry had to hold the line against an enemy that often outnumbered them many times over. At Gorgamla, the fearsome Persian scythe chariots were rendered useless, by the army's miraculous coordination, a testament to countless hours of rigorous, disciplined training. So, while luck may have played its part in Alexander's success, his achievements were forged primarily from his innate valor and his genius for war. The Europeans who consider him the greatest military commander in history are not indulging in mere hyperbole. Indeed, if you look at a modern deck of playing cards, the image on the King of Clubs is that of Alexander the Great. But to return to our narrative, did this colossal empire satisfy him? It did not. Less than a year after his return to Babylon, he was already planning his next campaign, the Arabian Peninsula to the south. But perhaps heaven itself wished for the young man to rest, or perhaps a jinn from the Arabian sands intervened. For just before he was to set out, Alexander suddenly and mysteriously expired. We use the words suddenly and mysteriously for good reason. Just 10 days before his death, he was drinking and carousing with Nearchus, the admiral of his newly formed fleet. This account, recorded by Plutarch in his Life of Alexander, is considered reliable. His death remains a mystery to this day. Ancient texts speak of a fever, what we would today call a severe febrile illness. Modern scientists, poring over scant and often contradictory evidence, have proposed any number of diseases: malaria, typhoid, pancreatitis, meningitis, even West Nile virus. But beyond death by disease, there is another theory. Murder, assassination by poison. This rumor was reported with great conviction by the historians of ancient Greece and Rome, who presented their cases with absolute certainty. They could not, however, explain what kind of poison could take more than 10 days to slowly kill a man like Alexander. This particular riddle found a possible solution only in 2003. A BBC documentary, citing the research of Dr. Leo Shep from the New Zealand National Poison Centre, identified a plausible culprit, Veratrum album or white hellebore, a plant whose toxins induce a slow, agonizing decline. So, which fiend would want to poison Alexander? The list of suspects is long. Upon close analysis, it seems nearly every official and confidant in his inner circle had a motive, but the most persistent and plausible theory points to one man, Antipater, the regent left in charge of Macedonia itself. Antipater had long enjoyed Alexander's trust. Otherwise, the king would never have left his homeland in the man's care for so long. The problem was that Alexander's mother, the formidable Olympias, also resided in the homeland, and a kingdom is seldom large enough for two such dominant personalities. The regent and the queen mother despised one another, each sending a steady stream of letters to Alexander, filled with accusations and slander against the other. Eventually, Alexander grew weary of the drama. He resolved to summon Antipater to Babylon and send a more trusted replacement back to Macedonia. In Antipater's eyes, this was not a simple transfer. It was a victory for Olympias. It was a purge. He needed no reminder of the fate of the great Parmenion, who, for all his loyal service, was executed without a second thought. For this reason, many historians believe the probability that Antipater dispatched an assassin with poison is exceedingly high. Regardless, in June of the year 323 BC, at the age of 32, Alexander died, leaving behind a vast and powerful empire. The greatest problem was this: he had not named a successor. By right of blood, there were two plausible candidates. The first was his elder half-brother, Ohidius. The second was his own child. Unfortunately, both candidates were problematic. His brother, though in his 30s, was a man who, though adult in years, was regrettably deficient in intellect. As for Alexander's child, it was still in its mother Roxana's womb. No one even knew if it would be a son or a daughter. It was, to put it plainly, an heir in utero. In this vacuum, the powers that be in Babylon devised a plan. They would place the intellectually disabled Ohidius on the throne with the royal title of Philip III. Then, One of Alexander's 7 royal bodyguards, a man named Perdiccas, would serve as regent, managing the actual affairs of state. If Alexander's unborn child proved to be a son, the two would rule jointly. Since one of them was a simpleton, it was assumed that if the boy could simply be raised to adulthood, the throne would naturally be his. Under this arrangement, the power of the regent Perdiccas was immense. The fool king was a mere figurehead, even if Alexander's son grew to inherit the throne. That would be more than a decade away. In the interim, Perdiccas was the de facto master of the Macedonian Empire. One might ask why Perdiccas was chosen for this role. There were 2 compelling reasons. First, Alexander had trusted him. According to the historian Diodorus Siculus, as Alexander lay dying, he gave his royal signet ring, the very symbol of his authority, directly to Perdiccas. The second reason was just as potent. His fiancée was the full-blooded sister of Alexander the Great himself. With these credentials, one would assume the position of Lord Perdiccas was secure. His authority absolute. The reality was precisely the opposite. No one was willing to obey him. And why? For the very same 2 reasons. With the royal ring on one hand and a Macedonian princess on the other. While a simpleton sat on the throne, everyone immediately concluded that this man would inevitably usurp the crown for himself, and so, the following events transpired. In the year 321 BC, as Perdiccas was transporting Alexander's body in a golden sarcophagus, intending to bury it in the Macedonian homeland, the procession was ambushed. Ptolemy, the governor of Egypt, seizing a moment of weakness, hijacked the funeral carriage and diverted Alexander's corpse to his own domain. You might ask, what is the use of stealing a dead body? In that age, it was of monumental importance. According to Macedonian law and tradition, only the reigning king had the right to bury his predecessor. Ptolemy's intentions were, to put it mildly, transparent. Perdiccas, naturally, could not tolerate such an audacious act. He immediately raised an army to punish Ptolemy. But in the course of the campaign, Perdiccas was cut down in his own tent, murdered by his subordinate, a man named Seleucus. The death of Perdiccas plunged the world into chaos. The governors Alexander had appointed across his empire declared their independence. The city-states of the Greek peninsula rose in rebellion. But in truth, cities like Athens and Sparta were but shadows of their former glory, destined to be mere supporting actors in this new age. They were swiftly crushed by a young commander named Antigonus, whose own father had been one of Alexander's most capable generals. Thus, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and a host of other Macedonian generals and tribal chieftains began a sprawling, brutal conflict that would last for more than 20 years. In Western history, they are known by a specific name, the Diadochi, the successors, for each one of them claimed to be the one true, orthodox heir to Alexander, while denouncing all others as traitors, hypocrites, bandits, and scoundrels. The wars they fought are therefore known as the Wars of the Successors. To shorten a very long story, there was no final victor. The successors were too evenly matched. Eventually, the conflict settled into a stalemate, resulting in the formation of 4 great kingdoms, or dynasties. We call them kingdoms because they were independent, and dynasties because each ruler styled himself a successor to the Macedonian Empire, merely under a new family name. The first was the Antigonid dynasty, which controlled the Greek peninsula, the Macedonian homeland, and considered itself the most legitimate heir. The second was the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, founded by Ptolemy I, with its capital in the new city of Alexandria. The third was the vast Seleucid dynasty, which controlled most of the old Persian Empire, including Syria and Mesopotamia. Its founder was Seleucus I, the very man who had murdered Perdiccas. The fourth and final dynasty, the Attalid dynasty, was a minor player on the historical stage. It occupied the territory between Greece and Persia, a region that had become a no-man's land during the wars. A small local kingdom named Pergamon rose to prominence and established its own rule. It is crucial to understand a concept here. The entire period from the outbreak of the successor wars until the final collapse of these four kingdoms around the year 30 BC, a span of some 300 years, is known to Western historians by a specific name. The Hellenistic Age. What does this mean? Think of it this way. The time before this is called the Classical Greek period, when the brilliant civilization of the Hellenes, their philosophy, politics, art, and science was born. During the Hellenistic Age, this civilization, like the seeds of a dandelion caught on the wind, was blown to every corner of Europe, Asia, and Africa. That wind was Alexander and his successors. Greek culture took root in these new lands and blossomed with renewed vitality. To use another metaphor, Alexander and his Macedonians were like bees. They produced little culture of their own, but after coming into contact with the pollen of Greek civilization, they became its great pollinators, spreading it across the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. So, if Greek civilization was so magnificent, why did it decline? And which European civilization rose to take its place? The American writer Edgar Allan Poe penned a famous line, "The glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome." Since its appearance in the 19th century, this phrase has become a touchstone of Western thought. It perfectly captures the two foundational epochs of the West. For we know that modern Western society rests on two pillars: democracy, which comes from Greece, and the rule of law, which comes from Rome. To study, and indeed to emulate, these two ages has been a matter of supreme importance. We have spoken at length of Greek democracy. It undeniably fostered an atmosphere of freedom that allowed Athens to achieve unparalleled heights in art, science, and philosophy, but to glorify it without reservation would be a mistake. As we have seen, it suffered from at least three fundamental flaws. First, the democracy of Athens was built upon the bedrock of slavery. By some estimates, slaves constituted 2/3 of the population. Even the most conservative scholarly accounts place the number at around 100,000. Or half the populace. The entire citizen assembly, the heart of the democracy, numbered only a few thousand. In short, it was a vast, disenfranchised population of slaves who supported the leisured lives of the citizens who debated endlessly in the public square. Second, Greek democracy was essentially an extension of the ancient tribal assembly. While the Greeks formalized and scaled this primitive, direct form of democracy, it was simply not suited for a large state, either in terms of geography or population. Aristotle himself was adamant that democracy could only function in a small community. His teacher, Plato, in his later work Laws, even specified a precise number of citizens, 5,040, and frankly, that number seems generous. Consider the case of Miltiades, the hero who defeated the Persians at Marathon. His very prestige aroused the suspicion of the Democrats under Athenian law. A man so prominent could be put to a vote of ostracism, to be exiled. Miltiades was present at the assembly, where an illiterate farmer, sitting beside him, asked for help in scratching a name onto his pottery shard for the vote. "Whose name?" Miltiades asked. "Miltiades," the farmer replied. Miltiades, while writing his own name for exile, asked the man, "What has he done to you? Why do you hate him so?" The farmer's response was chilling. "I do not know the man. I am simply tired of hearing everyone say he saved Athens." When direct democracy is scaled up, this is the result. A man with no knowledge of the issue holds the power of judgment to the detriment of the entire society. The final, and perhaps most damning, problem with Greek democracy was its utter reliance on the persuasive power of elites. It was a politics of the public square, a governance by grand oration. The disastrous Sicilian expedition, the sentencing to death of 7 victorious generals, these were not the decisions of expert military councils or sober courts of law. They were the decisions of a majority of citizens, swayed by the spectacular speeches of a few charismatic individuals. A populace lacking specialized knowledge is easily manipulated by gifted orators. The consequence is that the majority, using the power democracy has given them, overrules more expert judgment, often with catastrophic results. And yet, as an old saying goes, flaws do not obscure the brilliance of the jade. No city in history has had such a profound and lasting impact on humanity as Athens. This tiny city-state, with a population that rarely exceeded a few tens of thousands, sustained a level of cultural and educational achievement that was simply staggering. Its institutions and its policies were the foundation upon which that brilliance was built. Athens, and Greece as a whole, was worthy of its glory, but the world is ever-changing. And their glory was destined to be surpassed. The name that surpassed Greece was Rome. To speak of Rome, we must return to a war we have mentioned before. The Trojan War, fought around 1200 BC. After the city of Troy was sacked by the Greeks, many Trojans fled. Among them was Aeneas, the mythical son of the goddess Aphrodite and a mortal prince. Logically, one might flee east, away from the invading Greeks, but Aeneas, being a figure of legend, did not follow conventional logic. He and his followers sailed west, across the Mediterranean, eventually landing on the island of Sicily, and then on the much larger, boot-shaped peninsula known as the Apennine, or Italian Peninsula. Aeneas and his people traveled north and settled in a region then called Latium. According to the legend, he founded a kingdom called Alba Longa. Generations later, the throne passed to his grandson, Numitor. Unfortunately, Numitor had an ambitious younger brother, Amulius, who usurped the throne. He exiled Numitor and, in a particularly insidious move, forced Numitor's only daughter to become a Vestal virgin. By tradition, these priestesses were sworn to lifelong chastity. It was a bloodless way of ensuring his brother's line would end, and no heir would ever rise to seek revenge. But as the saying goes, man proposes and heaven disposes. Numitor's daughter, sequestered in her temple, became pregnant. The father, as the myth insists, was no mortal, but the god of war, Mars, who paid her a visit. The result was a pair of twin boys named Romulus and Remus. Amulius, his clever plan foiled, was enraged. He had the unfortunate mother buried alive for breaking her vows, and had the twin infants cast into the Tiber River, but he had clearly underestimated the situation. A child fathered by a god is not so easily drowned. The river spirit, seeking to curry favor with Mars, protected the infants and washed them ashore beneath a great fig tree. There, they were discovered by a she-wolf. The wolf, also fearing the god of war, carried the boys to the Palatine Hill and suckled them as her own. To be brief, Romulus and Remus grew into strong, intelligent, and formidable young men. How the she-wolf taught them literacy and martial arts is a detail upon which the legends are silent, but upon learning their true heritage, they returned, killed their great-uncle Amulius, and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. Their fame grew. A local tribe, the Latins, pledged their fealty to the two brothers. Today, the names Latin and Latium are world-renowned, but in the 8th century BC, they were but a small tribe in the plains of Latium. It was here that the brothers, now leaders of men, had a falling out. They stood on the Palatine Hill, one of 7 hills in the area. Remus wished to build their new city on another of the hills, but Romulus insisted they build on the Palatine Hill where they had been raised. The argument flared into a brawl, and the brawl ended in a flash of violence. With Remus dead at his brother's hand, Romulus then took the Latin people and founded a new city on the Palatine Hill, naming it, after himself, Rome. The city grew so famous, so magnificent, that the hill itself became legendary. The English word palace derives from its name, and as Rome expanded to encompass the other 6 hills, it earned its other famous name, the City of 7 Hills, a tragic irony given the reason for Remus's death. Sometimes one must simply have a longer view. What seems a matter of life and death today may be of no consequence tomorrow. The year the city of Rome was founded, according to tradition, was 753 BC. The structure of this new Rome was simple. Romulus was king. Beneath him were two institutions. One was the Curiate Assembly, an ancient tribal council. The other was an institution of Romulus's own creation, which would become far more famous, the Roman Senate. He selected 100 of the wealthiest and most powerful family heads and called them fathers, or paters, from which the word patrician derives. In these early days, the Senate was merely an advisory council, but we should afford these nascent institutions our respect. From them would evolve the upper and lower houses of modern European parliaments, and the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States. The American Senate, even today, bears the exact same name as its Roman progenitor, under the leadership of the wolf child Romulus. Rome began to expand like a wolf pack. Most expansion is for land and wealth, but Rome's first great expansion was for a very specific resource: women. This was a matter of grim necessity. The new settlement had attracted a great many criminals, outcasts, and escaped slaves. It was a society of single men. A society with a severe gender imbalance is, to put it mildly, unstable. Romulus's solution was simple: abduction. Nearby lived a tribe called the Sabines, who had many daughters. Romulus devised a plan and, through trickery, kidnapped a great number of Sabine women, distributing them as wives to his Roman men. He himself took the daughter of the Sabine leader as his own bride. The Sabines, naturally, could not tolerate this outrage, and years of bitter warfare ensued. During one final, climactic battle near the walls of Rome, a strange procession emerged from the city gates. It was a column of women and infants, the very Sabine women who had been taken, who had married Romans and who had borne their children. At their head was Hersilia, Romulus's own wife. They marched fearlessly between the warring lines of their fathers and their husbands and gave them a choice. Stark and absolute. 1. Lay down your arms and become one people. Or 2. Continue your fight. But perhaps it would be best if you first killed us, your daughters, your sisters, and these, your grandsons. What could be said? The weapons fell from their hands. The Latins and the Sabines joined and became the Romans. As Rome grew, so too did Romulus's power and prestige, and he began to pay less and less heed to his Senate. The fathers soon realized that while the king called them father, he was the one who held all the power, and so a most peculiar incident occurred. In the year 717 BC, on the 5th of July, the 54-year-old Romulus was conducting a ceremony on the field of Mars in Rome. Suddenly, a great storm descended. The sky went black, wind and dust filled the air, and the people scattered for cover. When the storm passed, they could not find Romulus. He was gone. As confusion mounted, a single senator stepped forward to clarify the matter. He had seen it all. The king, their king Romulus, had ascended into the heavens. As he rose on a dark cloud, he had whispered to the senator that he should henceforth be worshipped as the god Quirinus, and that if they prayed to him, he would ensure Rome became the capital of the world. The bewildered Roman people looked at the solemn senator and at the other senators standing behind him in clear support, and had little choice but to believe. To profess disbelief would be to invite not only the wrath of the Senate, but of their own pious neighbors. And so, they nodded their assent. The throne was vacant, and in that era, the Roman kingship was not hereditary, but elective. The Senate chose a man named Numa Pompilius. He was not a Latin, but a Sabine, a quiet, unassuming man who had to be begged to take the throne, and his reign was a reflection of his character. In the 43 years of his rule, Rome did not fight a single war. He focused entirely on internal affairs, instituting religious and civic reforms, and building the Temple of Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings. The gates of the temple, Numa declared, would be open in times of war and closed in times of peace. For all the years of his reign, they remained shut. After his death, the gates were almost never closed again. Rome passed through several more kings, each one expanding its territory. Finally, in 578 BC, Rome's sixth king, Servius Tullius, ascended the throne. He was a great reformer, most famously replacing the old tribal assembly with the centuriate assembly. This new body was organized not by bloodline, but by wealth and military contribution. It was a revolutionary step, breaking the grip of the old aristocracy and turning Rome from a tribal commune into a true state, where a man's status could be earned, not just inherited. Tullius ruled well, but his family life was a tragedy. He was murdered in a conspiracy led by his own daughter. Tullia and her husband, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. The story goes that after his death, his own daughter drove her chariot over his corpse. There was no great grievance. It was pure, naked ambition. Tarquin the Proud, who now became Rome's seventh and final king, lived up to his name. He was a tyrant. And his son, Sextus Tarquinius, was even worse. As the story is told, Sextus, visiting a military camp, became infatuated with Lucretia, the famously virtuous and beautiful wife of a Roman nobleman. That night, he snuck into her chambers and, at sword point, raped her, threatening to kill her and place the body of a slave next to hers, claiming he had caught them in adultery. Lucretia, having no real choice, submitted. The next morning, she summoned her father and her husband. She told them what had happened, made them swear an oath of vengeance, and then, drawing a hidden dagger, plunged it into her own heart. Among the men who swore that oath was one Lucius Junius Brutus. He was Tarquin's own nephew. But he hated his uncle, who had murdered his brother. To survive, Brutus had feigned idiocy for years. His name, Brutus, was Latin for the dullard. But in the moment Lucretia's blood was spilled, the dullard's illness was miraculously cured. He seized the bloody dagger, carried it to the Roman Forum, and delivered a fiery speech. He spoke of the tyranny of the king, the arrogance of his sons, and the final, unforgivable violation of Lucretia. His call was not merely for justice, but for revolution. He would tolerate no Tarquin, nor any other man, to be king in Rome. The environment was ripe. The people of Rome had long suffered under the yoke of the Tarquins. The Senate resented the king's absolute power. Brutus's speech was the spark that lit the pyre. The people rose up, drove the entire Tarquin family from the city, and resolved to abolish the monarchy forever. This event, in the year 509 BC, marks the end of the Roman kingdom, and it marks the beginning of the Roman Republic. The word republic comes from the Latin res publica, meaning the public thing or the common affair. It is a system where the state is not the property of a monarch, but a matter for the community. It presupposes that no single, hereditary ruler holds ultimate power, and that authority is derived from a set of common rules, which we call laws. It must be said, this was not a modern democracy. It was a republic of aristocrats, which still relied on slavery and excluded the poor from power. And how was this new Roman Republic to be governed? Brutus proposed a system of three parts: the Senate, the Centuriate Assembly, and a new office to replace the king. This new office was called consul.